Hey, Paul here. I'd like to thank our premier sponsor for this episode, Cisco Systems, building a bridge to possible in their newest platform to power an inclusive future for all. For more information, go to cisco.com. Hi, welcome to Business Brains and the Bottom Line. My name is Paul D'Allegro, your host. My guest today is George Crump, Chief Marketing Officer from StorONE. Welcome to the show, George.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. George, one of the things the main topic for today is storage. I know this sounds kind of mundane, but storage has really transformed over the last 10 years. I mean, if you look at historically, in the old days, you had a storage array with licenses tied to it. It was all on-prem, and then it, but that was complex, right? You had the three-tier architecture, and they tried to make it simple, so they came up with converged, right? Where you put the stack together and sold it as a unit, but there was some costs associated with that. And so and we'll talk about all the different storage systems that have come about since the old days. But in your opinion, what is the future of storage? Because it's you hear all these terms: software defined, consumption model, all those different things. What's your take on where storage is, where it's come from, but more importantly, where it's going in the future?
Well, I think, I've been in storage since late 80s, and, some of the stuff just kind of gets recycled. It gets a better brand name maybe,
right.
But as much as things change, they tend to stay the same, even in technology.
Yep.
I think in the future, there's not going to be any one thing. I think there's going to be different things for different use cases and different types of organizations. I think you'll see a mixture of companies that are mostly cloud, mostly on-prem, and then a fair amount of hybrid, and I think that, the consumption model, like what you mentioned, is really interesting because we see some customers that are very interested in consumption. At the same time, I've got customers saying, hey, I just want a 10-year and I'm done. They want to buy it all at once. They want to pay it for 10 years and they don't want to have to worry about it again. And so there is a sense of companies that, hey, I want to just own this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it varies, and I think that to be successful in the space requires being flexible and understanding exactly what customers want.
Yeah, I still think there is a large segment of the population out there that still wants to own their gear. Yep. Right? They feel comfortable.
Totally agree.
Yeah, but it seems like, at least in my opinion, George, a lot of the big manufacturers are trying to get out of the hardware business, and they're going to the software-defined consumption where it doesn't matter what the hardware looks like. You can put your software on, as long as it meets certain criteria, you can put your software on any hardware box, and it'll work and it'll perform well. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, that's what we started and are. We're a storage software solution that can run on a variety of different hardware platforms. I think you got to be very, very careful on both sides of that, though. I think
right.
that number one, the software has to be written in such a way that it's very abstracted from the hardware. I'm thinking like VMware. They did a great job of really abstracting themselves from the hardware. The storage software guys have not, frankly, done that good of a job, and it's really what we spent a lot of time in development on. At the same time, you do have to pay, because eventually it's going to run on some hardware somewhere.
Right.
You do have to pay attention to what that hardware is. The software companies have to make sure they're taking full advantage of all the capabilities that hardware may or may not deliver. And you've got to really pay attention to little things like firmware and
right.
Incompatibilities and things like that. And so the software has to deliver very good telemetry information so that you can do more than diagnose a problem, that you can predict a problem before it even occurs.
Right. So the big buzzword is cloud, George, right? So I think that as we go forward here, everyone thinks, I'm going to move everything to the cloud, but it's not quite as easy as or inexpensive as everyone thinks it is, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there's two elements that organizations need to be very, very careful Number one is the cost to actually move that application into the cloud. Will you get a return on that investment, if you will, in an appreciable amount of time? And then the second is really just from a raw cost perspective, does the cloud make sense? You know, one of the things that I get concerned with is customers that want to put old data in the cloud and use it as an archive. Well, you know, old data is called old data because it's old.
Yeah.
It doesn't move. You don't do much with it. And you know, the analogy I use is, look, when we used to fly a lot, when I flew to another city, I would rent a car because I was only going to be there for a little bit. But when I was at home, I owned a car, and it would be silly to go to Avis every day and rent a car for that purpose, right? You end up paying way too much for your car. And data is sort of the same way. The data that's the active and in use, maybe you rent that storage, but the data that you got to keep because it's a digital asset, you might have compliance reasons, different things like that, that you might want to own. So I think it's a balance again.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. I mean, I've always felt like the solution going forward is going to be somewhat of a hybrid. I mean, who knows what it's going to look like in 10, 20 years, but you and I will probably be retired by then, so it's not going to matter. But yeah, I think there's going to be some on-prem, some in the cloud, and you have to do the analysis, right? I mean, there's some companies that say my data will never be in the cloud. That's just the way it's going to be. And, you know, what can you do with that, right? So, so where do you see storage in, say, 10, 20 years? I mean, it's changed so much in the last 10 years. Where do you see it going in 10 years? I mean, you're on the leading edge of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the two parameters that we see changing from a hardware perspective is if you will, performance per unit has increased substantially. The per drive capability. We are testing right now in our labs some soon to be released drives flash drives that on a per drive basis are going to deliver over 800,000 IOPS just per one drive. The next generation of Intel Optane is going to deliver somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million IOPS per drive, right? And so that's a huge factor. We know that 30 terabyte flash SSDs are shipping now.
Oh wow!
We expect Micron has announced that they'll be delivering 100 terabyte SSDs before the end of the year.
That's unbelievable.
Right? So you look at these different capacities and things. Well, all of those things have ramifications on software and how you design infrastructure and things like that. And so the pressure really comes back on software, right? In the early 2000s and the late 90s, software almost had no pressure on it because the Intel CPUs were really, really slow. We were dealing with hard disk technologies. You know, there was nothing to really push software. It didn't really matter how efficient you were. Now we're dealing with technology that has, microseconds of latency and, just these huge per drive capacities. And so you got to make sure your software doesn't get in the way of that innovation.
Right. Yeah. So what's your take on, from a performance standpoint, on-prem versus going to the cloud? I mean, I would assume that if you're in an HPC environment, cloud may be a little bit tough to meet the kind of the latency requirements that are needed. Yes or no?
I think honestly, the cloud guys are quickly closing the gap there.
Are they?
I think it'll depend on the workload, right? So what I think you'll see more of is people pushing a data set to the cloud to throw 100,000 cores at it, get an answer, and pull it right back. Right. That's a really intelligent, in my opinion, a really intelligent use of the cloud. Now, there's some conditions there. A, can your workload work like that? If you threw 100,000 cores at it, would it make a difference as opposed to 8 cores? There's a lot of applications that won't meet that requirement. And then B, is the data set or the result small enough that you could push it back and forth and have it make sense, right? I think IT professionals need to look at the cloud as another, tool in the tool belt. Yep. And just like you don't use a hammer for everything, you don't use the cloud for everything. You just got to look at it and see what makes the most sense. I I get really nervous when I hear always, oh, we've got a cloud first strategy. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Why would you want to do that? Right. It should be, we have a cloud when it makes sense strategy. And when it doesn't make sense, we're not going to try to fit it. Right.
Well, all the buzzwords, right? Digital transformation and cloud first. I mean, everyone throws those terms around like, it's no big deal, but and I agree with you. We see our customers that same thing, right? They say they'll come up with these slogans, and I'll be like, really? I mean, how did you come up with that? Or just see a webinar one day and all of a sudden decide that we're moving everything to the cloud?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and that's what we see too. I think there are things that the cloud does particularly well, like handle really, really fast scale because you don't have to go, in theory, order equipment and things like that. But the long-term business in many cases isn't necessarily helped by the cloud. We've seen, I deal with probably three or four companies a month that are exiting the cloud,
right?
Either and mostly because of the cost or inconsistent performance.
Yeah, they move to the cloud and then they get their first bill, right?
Yes. And they can't understand what it says, but they know it's really expensive, right? So I think that's a real challenge. I remember being at a Gartner conference a few years ago, and the Gartner guy stood up and said, well, you should plan on hiring somebody full time to essentially translate your bill for you. I'm like, wow, that seems so wrong on so many levels.
That makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. So it's just like I said, I think you just take an approach that it's sort of like flash and hard disk, or flash, hard disk, and tape. Why get all, committed to one of these different things? They're just technology. Use the one that makes the most sense at that moment in time, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. Now, I will say this, all the software as a service that things like, for instance, Salesforce.com, and a lot of things make sense, right? That just offload that to the cloud, get that off your off-prem, and no sense even, hosting that on your own stuff. And that's been a big change. I think 10, 15 years ago, no one would even thought about doing that, right? Not like Office 365, right? I mean, moving that off-prem makes sense. I mean, and I think I'd like to think that, more and more of that will move to the cloud. But I got to believe that the costs have to come down eventually, right? I mean, in some cases, it's so expensive to move everything to the cloud that it's cost prohibitive. So that's what it forces people to pull stuff back.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, if you look at our Salesforce.com cost now, and we're not a huge company, we're 60, 70 people right now. The cost of doing Salesforce.com is not a small line item in the budget, right? And I try very aggressively to get that out of the marketing budget, because that thing's big, and you start to think about, I was kidding my VP of sales the other day. I said, can't we just kind of do the same thing with Google Sheets or something?
Oh, God,
So
that's we used.
I think.
Now, we use ConnectWise at our company, and, to build that on your own would be virtually impossible. That's the other aspect of it, too, right?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think that just like everything else, you're going to see a kind of an alternate response, right? And so I think that as we get better at software development and it gets more intelligent, we have so much power on a laptop now. We may see a new CRM, right, that is totally on-prem, but is so easy to use on-prem that you're not worried about it, right? That maybe it has its own synchronization or whatever might be the aspect that does it for you. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out some applications coming back on-prem. I think applications are really expensive. There's some that just make sense to put up there because they don't, like Exchange. I don't know if anybody's really going to ever have an email server again.
Yeah,
it's just easy, but that's a very containable asset. Salesforce.com, and I'm not picking on Salesforce. We use it obviously, but I could see somebody saying, what if you could put it on-prem and cut your bill by 2/3? Would it be worth it to pay for a server and back it up and all that kind of stuff? That's something you got to, as a business owner, something you got to start looking at, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree, and a lot of variables. I will say this about the storage industry. it has definitely gotten a lot simpler. I mean, that's why I think hyper-converged is a big one today, because people want the easy button, right? I mean, before in the old days, you had to buy the compute, you had to buy the networking, you had to buy the storage with the virtualization layer. Now you can get that all in one box. And, we've been at some presentations where the storage admin says, so if we get this hyper-converged, what am I going to do? Because I'll be out of a job. That's a big concern. But, I mean, obviously, if they're a good employee, they can be redeployed in another capacity. But what's your take on that?
On hyper-converged, I think that and this is really true of any kind of cluster scale-out type of design, is it's good as you start, but you got to be careful how far you scale, right? A multi-node hyper-converged infrastructure, even a multi-node scale-out storage infrastructure starts to weigh down on complexity, right? That east-west communication between all the different nodes really starts to weigh heavy. And hyper-converged is probably one of the worst because there's so much east-west traffic on the network at that point. So your networking can really become an issue. And I think there's a line that you tend to cross that it just becomes very difficult. The other thing I tend to see a lot in hyper-converged is the system sort of gets out of balance. You either end up with, and it varies from customer to customer, you either end up with too much capacity, storage capacity, or you end up with too much compute capacity. In most cases, it's too much compute capacity because you're keeping up with storage capacity demands. So then that starts to not make sense. What I always advise customers is, look, hyper-converged is fine to start, but make sure you have an exit, either that you can, turn the solution into a different type of a scaling methodology, or that you can easily convert to a more traditional storage architecture.
Yeah, and the other parameter too, George, is what type of technical bench they have. And that's one of the appealing things about hyper-converged we've heard is, look, I don't have the staff to manage the old 3-tier architecture. This is nice. We get everything in one box. It's a little bit easier to manage. I don't need I don't need these experts to manage it. So that's kind of what we hear from our customers. But I think you're right. I mean, there are certain situations where, the 3-tier architecture is still the way to go.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of marketing built around a lot of these, like Cloud 2, right? There's a lot of marketing built around these things that once as the further you get into it, it's not necessarily that you've eliminated the tiers, you've just had a skill shift, right? If you go to for example, you go to the cloud, you may not need as many on-prem guys, but now you need a few guys that are really good at cloud infrastructure, right? Because that's a whole different ballgame. The same with HCI, right? You need guys that are good at, maybe better at networking, better at system load balancing. I mean, there's a lot of variables there. And again, I'm always going to say, pick something that has the most options. Go the path you want to, but know that change is coming, and it may make more sense to not, right? I mean, you go back to the original part of the conversation, we were talking about these high performance drives, high capacity drives. We're talking within a 2U box now, 700 terabytes of capacity, delivering 2.5 million IOPS.
That's amazing. Right?
So how much more complicated is that than HCI? I don't think much.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But it's amazing that, heck, I remember when terabyte drives first came out, we thought that was like, unbelievable. I mean, wow. Yeah. Then it was 2 terabytes, 4s. Now it's 100 terabytes. It's like insane.
Yeah, it's just going to keep going.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, fascinating stuff. Well, tell me a little bit about what you guys are doing on the leading edge, because you guys are doing pretty well, and good products, good company.
Yeah, thank you. So we're a little different than most companies in the space. If you look at most technology storage companies in particular, they come to market, they have a feature. They kind of adopt or co-opt a piece of hardware technology, and then they race to market. Frankly, in most cases, in an effort to get bought by one of the bigger players.
I'd agree with that.
And you and you can go through the list.
Everyone wants to go public,
these guys are, well, and most of them don't go public well, right? So it's really hard to maintain valuation if you can't show a profit. eventually that catches up to you, right?
Agreed.
And so if you look at the industry, it's full of these situations where they essentially leverage the core piece of storage technology that was already available, and then added a feature to that technology like deduplication or automated tiering, hybrid, or anything like that. And then they race to market, and they tend to do pretty well because marketing generally works well. And then what do, right? So what we did is sort of the exact opposite. We took a very slow path to market. We were 8 years in development with our software, and we rewrote the fundamental foundations of storage code.
Yep.
So the literal math in our product is different. The way we calculate reads, calculate writes, calculate where data should be, how a snapshot should be taken, how RAID parity should be calculated. All that's fundamentally different and very, very efficient. And so going back to that example I gave with a 2U box, a 2U box filled with 24 30 terabyte drives capable of each producing 800,000 IOPS. The problem for most legacy storage products is because they didn't go back and do that work on the core code,
right,
they can't extract anything close to that, right? They're getting, in that same configuration, they're getting maybe 200,000 IOPS, right? So the way our software works is we're delivering, in that particular situation, close to 2 million IOPS. We're seeing RAID rebuild times. Again, these are 30 terabyte drives. We're seeing RAID rebuild times of 3.5 minutes.
Wow, that's impressive.
Our competition, thank you. Our competition will take 10 hours to do that same rebuild.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a fundamental difference in the way the technology works, and took a little while for us to get to market. We're like the oldest startup in history, but now we've got all the pieces in place, and things are going well for us.
So it's funny you say that. There's a lot of startups that are 6, 7, 8 years old, by the way.
Yeah.
But everyone's got the same wishes to either be bought or go public, but again, not quite that easy.
Yeah. Our plan is to go public, but to do so profitably. We expect to be run rate profitable by the end of this year, and it'll probably, if we can get there, we'll be the first storage company in the last 20 years to be profitable.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
Yeah.
But yeah.
A lot of these startups are great at raising funds.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're great at selling.
Yeah, we've had a very small amount of fundraising. What I always tell people is I don't know why people put out press releases that they got more funding, because that's basically, you're putting out a press release saying that, oh, and by the way, everybody at my company just had all their stock options diluted.
Yeah.
Right? It's a really bad deal for the current employees.
Yeah, no, and everyone does. It's funny that it's basically saying, hey, we found someone that believes in us, and they gave us 30 million, 25 million, 100 million, whatever that number is.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a problem. People equate funding with success, where they really should, equate profitability and revenue with success.
Yeah. Well, and you hit it right in the head. I mean, a lot of companies they're trying to get their run rate to a certain point. Forget about profitability. Yeah. Once they get to that, whatever that number is, 100 million, 200 million, then they're ripe to either be bought or go public, and that's when they all cash in.
Yeah.
But
and I think the challenge, when you go, especially when you go public, because public means public. It means you got to share everything, right?
Yep.
And so now you've got to explain, the advantage of being private is you don't need to explain losses and things like that. But now you kind of do, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, you have to answer to the street. It's a different ball game.
Exactly.
Yep. So,
and
I did want, now you guys are software defined, correct? Where you don't have a specific, right? Okay, cool. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that.
The way we approach the market is, again, for us, it's all about choices. So a lot of customers want a turnkey solution, right? There's probably a smaller amount that don't. And so the way we did that is, so we're the first company that I know of anyways, that published their pricing on their website. So usually with storage vendors, it's sort of this, song and dance, end of the quarter weirdness, right?
Do I have a deal for you?
Ours are published. Yeah, exactly. Ours are published right there on our website, but you can select the hardware. So we pre-configured solutions that we know work and support. So like if you're an HP guy, there's an HP configuration. If you're a Dell guy, there's a Dell configuration, right? So you can just go through and select those different things. And it gives, again, for us, it's all about flexibility and also transparency. We want to be very upfront with our customers and our partners as far as how much this is going to cost.
Yeah, no, I think it's a smart strategy. Being hardware agnostic gives you more options because you know how it works. I mean, some people have a preference for a certain vendor, right? Whether it be, like you say, a Dell or an HP or a Cisco or, brand X. And, if that's their feeling, that's their feeling. But as a software, I guess, StorONE's a software company, essentially. You give your customers choices, which makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And just at that point, it just comes down to managing that hardware stack. And that gets back to that telemetry data that I was talking about and things like that.
Yeah. So what do you think of, all the big boys? It seems like a lot of the big boys are going to this consumption model. That seems to be the trend. I know HP's with their Green Lake program. I know Dell's doing that because I have a lot of friends at those companies, and they're really shrinking the old school storage sales forces are shrinking. And it seems like they're really trying to get out of the hardware business and go into the consumption business. Well, now, I say that the data still has to be stored somewhere. Right? And it's not like hard, I think when people think of the cloud, they look up in the sky and go, oh, it's going to be magically up there somewhere. But as we both know, all the cloud means is instead of storing it in my data center, I'm going to store it in someone else's data center. And someone else's data center, whether you know what that product is, it's still got to be hardware based.
Right.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I again, for us, it's choice. If you want consumption, we've got a great consumption model. If you don't want consumption, fine. We've got a turnkey solution or a software only solution like you had mentioned. So it really depends. I think the only thing I would say about the consumption models that some of these suppliers are putting out there, because they're essentially trying to compete at some level with the business model part of the cloud.
Right.
I think what you got to be careful with is what are the rules around consumption, right? Are you, do you have to have a minimum level, and is there a penalty for shrinking? How quickly can you grow? I mean, all those things in the cloud are literally dials you turn, right? And you can turn them anytime you want to. The more restrictions that you put in place on these consumption programs that these vendors have, the more they start to look like leases in disguise, right? And so you want to be very careful. Now, if you're a company that likes to lease things, knock yourself out. It's fine. You might as well just get a regular lease. But the consumption model that I've seen in many cases are literally just, what I call leases in disguise. They're just another way to say the same thing.
Yeah. So for our listeners out there that really aren't technologists, so to speak, what a consumption model means is you pay for basically what you use. So if you need 100 terabytes, you're paying for 100. If you consume 120, you're paying for 120 terabytes versus buying a petabyte array and have it be 80% empty to start with. So there's pros and cons to that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, it's countered by how scalable, granularly scalable is the solution. Could you, just plug in a couple extra drives and going down the road? Years and years ago, vendors went to the concept of selling completely full shelves of drives to meet a customer capacity level. I think that's a challenge. And again, that gets back all the way back to that being able to pull maximum drive performance, right? So one of the reasons they want to sell a full shelf is so they have more drives and therefore can deliver more performance, right? So if you could get there with half of a shelf, and then when you need more capacity, drop in 2 or 3 more drives, you fundamentally have the same advantages of a consumption model, except you own it.
Right. Yeah. So George, if someone, wanted to get in touch with you to kind of further discuss some of the options at StorONE, how would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, a simple way to get there is just go to storone.com. That's StorONE.com. And all the information is right there on the page. There's obviously ways to contact us from there as well.
Sure.
And that's the best way to do it.
So cool. Well, before we finish up here, I mean, any last pearls of wisdoms for our listeners on the storage, the future of storage? I mean, you're one of the guys. I followed you for a while. You're one of the industry veteran, and you're pretty knowledgeable what the trends are in the industry. Anything you want to leave the listeners with?
Well, to your point, right? Prior to joining StorONE, I was a founder and lead analyst at a company called Storage Switzerland. We did this full time. To me, what it always comes back to, and unfortunately I've said it a couple times today, is it always comes back to you want a very flexible solution, because you really don't know what the future is going to bring, and the quicker you can adapt to those new changes, the better you're going to be from an IT perspective. And that's in terms of performance, capacity, data protection, data retention. All of those things fall into this. And so you really want to look for options and flexibility, because you just don't know what's coming next.
Right. No, I'd agree with that. I mean, always having options is a good thing.
Yep.
So, well, cool. Well, George, I appreciate you jumping on today. Thanks for joining us. And who knows, maybe we'll have you, maybe when the new technology, something new comes out, we'll have you on to discuss that too.
Okay, sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, that's it for Business Brains and the Bottom Line. This is Paul DeLegro signing off.